So welcome to the first day of our lectures, and we're going to start out in the period with the contact and early American colonial eras as a title. So for day one, there's going to be 3 lectures, and then within each module, some of these lectures might be found in 3 separate sections. So we'll start out with contact with the Indians and the early colonial maritime world. We'll move on to piracy and privateers of New England and beyond. And finally, we'll close with the Revolutionary era's ties to New Hampshire. So let's begin with this concept of early contact and the early colonial eras before the Revolution. So before we get into this, some things that you really want to be thinking about as we go into these lectures, prepping yourself with questions. So what is it that you already know about New Hampshire history, and especially relating that to maritime history? So then from the maps that we looked at in the first, in the map lecture, what locations might we be more focused on? I mean, do they necessarily have to be on the ocean? And then what is important about these topics within New Hampshire history? Why study them? And finally, how could you find out more? So first up, we're looking at contact and early colonial eras, and the focus is really on Native American tribes locally. We're going to look at early settlements and transport in between them on the Great Bay, New Hampshire, and out on the coast. And then finally, we'll have a case study that we look at, the Hart's Cove wreck. And each of these are divided into separate videos and separate sections within the module. American Indians of the Abenaki and other Algonquin language-speaking nations, along with their predecessors, had inhabited the territory of coastal New Hampshire for thousands of years before European contact. Unfortunately, there's little that we can find out other than through archaeology of what it was like then. So our first real knowledge are these descriptions written by Europeans that are still kept in the archives. So one of the earliest recorded descriptions of New Hampshire comes from John Smith. So this was from his explorations that we were talking about in 1614. So having returned to the Americas and he's exploring the coast of New England, most of the time his crew spent fishing, but Smith and 8 others took a small boat on a coasting expedition where they traded the Indians for furs. Captain Smith, along with several other of the gentlemen who were literate on the crew, kept notes on the nature, the geography, the people, and the events during their voyages. So on sighting the islands off the coast, he, of course, named them after himself. They are now known as the Isle of Shoals. He described them as the remarkablest isles, and mountains for landmarks are these, a heap together, none near them, and many a barren rock. And so this description was published, the description of New England, which had a major influence on the English migration that happened. So they came into New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and other New England states. So it might have been a bit of exaggeration when he published it. He described it as an incredible abundance of most sorts of fish, much fowl, and sundry sorts of good fruits for man's use. So in the early years of contact, as settlers arrived from Europe, interactions were often beneficial, encompassing trade and this cross-cultural learning of how to survive, and their watercrafts and their navigation and maps during this time. Of course, as we were talking about, these illustrations along the edges are fascinating. So in this one, you can even see the construction differences between the one farther forwards with these bow and stern pieces, and then behind the smaller ones are completely different shape. And then over on the right, you can see a whale hunt happening off of the end of Long Island. So let's get into the actual crafts themselves, the boats that they did have. Looking over on the right-hand side of this picture, you can see these dugout canoes pulled up on the shore where the native Indians are trading with, I believe it's Spaniards. So although it's much further south from New England, down in coastal North Carolina, the explorer Arthur Barlow described the process of making dugout canoes in 1584, and this piece is taken from David Stick's article, Indian Canoes in North Carolina. So he describes, Barlow states, their boats are made of one tree, either of pine or of pitch trees, a wood not commonly known to our people, nor found growing anywhere in England. They have no edged tools to make them withal. They burn down some great tree, or take such as are wind fallen, and putting myrrh and rosin upon one side thereof, they set fire unto it, where it hath burnt a hollow. They cut out the coal with their shells, and everywhere they would burn it deeper or wider, they lay on their fumes, which burn away the timber, and by this means they fashion very fine boats, such as will transport 20 men. Since Barlow knew no native language at the time of his visit, he could not easily have learned of this procedure secondhand, so he must have seen some or all of it. Whether because of his lack of understanding of Algonquin, or simply that his visit was brief, Barlow's descriptions of the process of construction is not entirely consistent with some of the later observations by other explorers. So Thomas Harriot, who spent almost a year in the same region in 1585, described Indian boat building at greater length. So according to Harriot, the Indians living near Roanoke Island commonly made their wood not of pine, as Barlow had reported, but of something called rakyak. The species Harriet meant is still in doubt. It might be a tulip tree, which is easily worked, but they're kind of quick to rot and become waterlogged, or it could have been more durable white cypress. Regardless of preferences, the builder probably used any tree that was the right size and as their circumstances dictated. So the explorer Harriot really had a sharper eye than Barlow for certain details, and so made Indian canoe making sound less haphazard. So Harriot makes no references to the inflammable gums that they help burn the wood with. These would have been really useful in the controlled burning of greenwood. The use of wet clay protects parts as they're burning it, and eventually the entire form is created. So dugouts were so stout and dependable. Coastal Indians were really actually very slow to adopt anything from European settlers, the planked boats. And colonists, however, quickly adopted the canoe, and they adapted it to have a sail on it. Far later, the Indians would copy some of these improvements, such as the flatter bottoms or the pointed ends. And writing in the early 18th century, John Lawson noted that their cypress canoes would far outlast 4 boats. So let's move on to the birch bark canoe. So here you have the dugouts that are these really solid single piece, and we'll move into this super lightweight, transportable, and more inland shapes. So the birch bark canoe was the principal means of water transportation for natives within more inland waters, and later the voyagers going up further north into French Canada. And they used it extensively in the fur trade. So Samuel de Champlain noted the canoe's elegance and speed and remarked that it was the only craft suitable for such navigation through this real network of these shallow streams. They're rocky, these ponds, lakes, and swift waters of the east. They were really a necessity for nomadic tribes. And the types of birch bark canoes used by tribal peoples often differed according to which route they thought it would be intended to go on, and then of course how much cargo they wanted it to carry. So you definitely have a lot more people than you see here with these tribal members in the boat. They have, it looks like, sorting reeds and pounding on them within their canoe. So the skills required to build a birch bark canoe were passed down through generations of master builders. The frames were usually of cedar. These would be soaked in water and bent to the shape of the canoe. The joints were then sewn with spruce or white pine roots, which were pulled up, split, and boiled by the women. And then the seams themselves, where they would be waterproofed with like hot spruce or pine resin that are gathered and then applied with a stick along the seams. And even during travel within the canoe, the paddlers would often reapply this resin to make sure that the canoe stayed watertight. So part of learning about their water transport wasn't just the shape or the construction of the boat itself, but how they use them, what it helped assist them in doing, such as acquiring whales. It's the one seen here in this photo that is full of action, and the illustrator has taken possibly what he's heard and recreated this scene. The tribes at the end of Long Island were known for their whale hunts, and they would have taught early colonists how to go out from shore for nearshore whaling. So let's move on now to the early settlements around the Great Bay and the water transportation that went in between those towns.